There is a soup pot in a farmhouse kitchen in the hills of Kyushu that no longer remembers its grandmother's recipe. It sits on a shelf above a cold hearth. Its dark clay lined with a crust so old and deep, it looks like the inside of a cave. The first time steam rises through that crust in 30 years, something stirs that no one expected to wake. The pot has a crack running from its rim to its belly, a pale scar where the clay was mended once with rice paste and patience. Its lid is chipped, its handle wrapped in a strip of worn cotton that must have been white once but is now the color of wood smoke and soil. If you lift it, you feel the weight of every meal it ever held. Not just the broth, but the memory of the hands that stirred, the voices that laughed, the silence that settled when the fire died. There is a rhythm to this crust. It is not smooth. It is ridged and pocked and darkened in layers like the rings of a tree that grew for 100 years in the dark. One layer holds a miso broth from the winter of 1962, when the snow was so deep the grandmother could not reach the village for a week. Another layer holds a thin soup made from the last of the winter radish, served to a child who coughed through the night and would not stop trembling. The pot held that warmth close, as if it knew the child needed it. And beneath that, there is a layer that even the pot cannot fully name. It is the earliest one, the first seasoning, laid down by a grandmother whose name has been forgotten. The pot remembers the feel of her hands, the calluses on her palms, the way she hummed a song about the sea while she stirred, but it does not remember what she put in the pot on that first day. The recipe is gone. The grandmother is gone. The soup that once held the family together has dissolved into the dark, and the pot sits alone, holding only the ghost of a taste it cannot quite recall. This is the moment where most of us would turn away from the pot, convinced a clean surface is the only way forward. But if you have ever felt a strange tenderness toward an old thing, a chair worn smooth by hands you never met, a pan with a seasoning so dark it looks like a living thing, then you already know what the pot is about to teach the granddaughter. Subscribe if you want to stay beside this hearth until the fire catches. I would love to know in the comments, do you own something with a patina that feels like a memory you did not earn? For years the pot sat in silence. The farmhouse was empty. The children had grown and moved to the city where soup came from packets and no one hummed while they stirred. The pot did not complain. It did not weep. It simply held its layers one atop the other, like a diary written in fat and patience and the slow accumulation of time. But then the granddaughter came back. She was the youngest, the one who had pressed her palm against the pot as a child and learned to know the temperature by its warmth. She was 30 now, tired of the city, tired of food that had no memory. She'd come back to the farmhouse to find something she could not name. She found the pot. She lifted it from the shelf. The cotton wrapping crumbled in her fingers. The lid was stuck, sealed by the decades of stillness. She set the pot on the hearth and lit the fire for the first time in a generation. The flame rose. The clay began to warm, and the pot, for the first time in 30 years, felt something stir in its deepest layer. Not the memory of the recipe, but a question. Who are you? And what do you want me to hold? The pot knew something the granddaughter did not. It knew that a vessel's memory is not a record of ingredients. It is a record of hands, and those hands are not replaceable. Archaeologists who study the oldest pots in the world have found something remarkable. When they extract lipid residues from unwashed clay vessels that are 10,000 years old, they find chemical signatures that still carry the trace of wild boar and millet, of fish and herbs, of meals cooked by people whose names are dust. The pot does not remember the cook, but it remembers the meal. The chemistry of memory is written in the very clay, in the polymerization of fats and the slow absorption of smoke and steam. A pot that has never been washed is not dirty. It is an archive. The granddaughter did not know this. She only knew that when the steam began to rise from the old pot, the smell was not fresh. It was not clean. It was something else entirely. It smelled of wood smoke and damp leather, and the ghost of something sweet that might have been ginger. It smelled of the grandmother who hummed while she stirred, the one whose voice she could almost remember, like a song heard through a wall. She hesitated. The crust was dark and thick and unfamiliar. Her first instinct was to scrub, to reach for steel wool and detergent and restore the clay to its original pale. That was what the city had taught her. That clean was good, that old was dirty, that the past should be erased to make room for the new. But the pot knew something her hands did not. It knew that the crust was not grime. It was the only record of a recipe that had never been written down. It was the diary of a grandmother who had died before she could teach anyone how to make her soup. The granddaughter paused. She put her palm against the warm clay, and she felt for a moment the faintest pulse of something that was not heat. It was the rhythm of a wooden ladle stirring, slow and steady. The rhythm of a woman who had cooked the same soup for 60 years and never needed to measure anything, because her hands knew. The granddaughter did not scrub. She did not wash. She reached for a knife and a cutting board and a bowl of miso that had been left on the shelf for no one to use. She filled the pot with water. She lit the fire, and she began to stir. She did not know the recipe. She had never tasted her grandmother's soup. She had only the ghost of a flavor that the pot held in its deepest layer. A taste that was no longer present, but somehow still present. Like the memory of a song that the body remembers even when the mind has forgotten. This is the turning point. The moment the granddaughter chose trust over control, inheritance over hygiene. It is the same choice every one of us faces when we inherit something old and worn and uncertain. Subscribe now, so you do not miss what happens when the steam finally rises. And tell me in the comments, have you ever chosen to keep a thing exactly as it was, because scrubbing it felt like a betrayal? The pot settled onto the hearth. The water began to bubble. The crust released a thin, dark ribbon of something that swirled into the broth. It was not a flavor. It was a question. Who are you? And the granddaughter answered with every ingredient she chose, with every hesitation, with every moment of not knowing whether she was making the soup correctly. She was not trying to replicate the past. She was trying to become worthy of it. There is a tradition in Japan called kizushi, the belief that a well-seasoned pot is a living thing, that its patina is not neglect but proof of a vessel's history. Family recipe inheritance memoirs from Nagasaki describe pots passed down for generations, never washed with soap, never scrubbed clean, carrying the accumulated memory of every meal cooked within them. The patina is the inheritance, the crust is the recipe book. But the granddaughter had no recipe book. She had only the pot and the ghost of a grandmother, and the ache of wanting to belong to something older than herself. The soup simmered for hours. She added ginger, then leeks, then a handful of rice that had been left in the pantry from the last harvest before the farmhouse was abandoned. The pot absorbed everything she gave it. The crust deepened. The layers grew. And somewhere in the dark clay, the memory of the grandmother's recipe stirred. Not as a set of instructions, but as a feeling of hands that had stirred with love, a feeling of a soup that had been made for people who needed warmth, not perfection. The granddaughter stirred. She hummed a song she did not know she remembered, a song about the sea. The candle flickered. Shadows stretched across the clay. The pot did not judge. It did not compare. It simply held a new broth alongside the old, the granddaughter's hands beside the grandmother's hands. 2 generations of warmth separated by decades of silence. The soup was not the same. It could never be the same. But the pot did not need it to be the same. It only needed someone to hold the memory of holding. When the soup was done, the granddaughter lifted the pot from the fire. Steam rose in a white column, carrying the smell of ginger and miso, and something else. Something that tasted like the ghost of the grandmother's secret. The thing that had been lost and was now, in a new way, found. She tasted the broth. It was not her grandmother's soup. It was hers, but the pot remembered both. And somehow that was enough. She set the pot back on the shelf. She did not wash it. The crust was darker now, deeper, carrying the memory of her first meal in the farmhouse. She left it there, waiting for the fire to be lit again. And if you ever find a pot that has not met the soapy sponge in 50 years, a pot that sits in silence in a farmhouse where the grandmother's recipe has been forgotten, do not reach for the steel wool. Do not try to erase the layers that came before you. Fill it with water. Light the fire. Stir. The recipe is not written. It is held. And if you listen closely through the crack in the clay, through the crust that holds the memory of 1,000 meals, you will hear a question that has no answer. Because the answer is not something you find. It is something you become. This is where the story leaves us. Standing at the edge of an old pot, with the choice to become worthy of what it holds. Subscribe before you walk away from this hearth, so you can come back when the next pot rises out of the silence. And let me hear one word in the comments. The word that the granddaughter answered when the pot asked, Who are you? Share it, and let it sit here, in the dark, beside the steam.